Okay, I'm delighted to be joined today by Paul Shapiro, who is the host of the Business for Good podcast, author of Clean Meats: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. And more pertinently for this interview, he is the CEO and co-founder of the Better Meat Company, a food tech focused on creating sustainable meat alternatives using mycoprotein. Paul, welcome to Protein Production Technology International.
Nick, so great to be with you.
It's great to have you with us. Now, I'm going to talk about the company first. So, what drives your passion for creating a more compassionate and sustainable food system? How do your personal values align with the mission of the Better Meat Company?
Sure, Nick. So I became a vegan 31 years ago, nearly to this day. We're recording in September of 2024. So it was in September of 1993 that I
Wow.
decided to leave animals off my plate. And I did that primarily out of a concern for helping animals. I had somebody showed me a video of what happens inside of factory farms and slaughter plants. And, back in 1993, Nick, there wasn't YouTube or anything. Like I was like a VHS tape that this friend of mine showed me. And for those of your listeners who are not old enough to know what VHSs were, imagine like a rectangular piece of plastic that you put into a box called a VCR, and that was the only thing you could watch. So, if you didn't have the right video, you were screwed. There was no way to go switch to something else. So anyway, I saw this, and my friend showed it to me not because he thought like one should be a vegetarian. He just showed it to me because he thought it was cool. Like it was like, oh, this is sick, dude. You got to watch this, right? But when I viewed it, it really shook me. And I thought, oh my Lord, could you imagine? Like what if those are my dogs who were in those cages, or my dogs who are being hung upside down and having their throats cut? Like there's nothing I wouldn't have done to prevent my dogs from enduring that fate. And I thought, if I wouldn't want it to happen to my dog, why should I have it happen to any animal?
Mm.
And as a result, I decided to become a vegetarian. But I did not know about vegan eating. I was a young kid, and I wrote to the animal protection groups at the time, and they sent me back these snail mail packages. And they had this literature on what I thought was called veganism. It's like, okay, like what are these vegans? They don't eat any animal products at all. And I thought, it seems well intentioned, but you'll probably die if you do that. And I remember thinking about it like holding your breath. Like, you can hold your breath for a certain amount of time, but if you do it too long, you're going to die, right? And I thought, well, maybe you can go some time without eating any animal products, but if you do it too long, you'll probably die. So I then started volunteering at the animal protection groups, and I met these people who I learned were not vegans, but were vegans, and many of them have been doing it for years. And then I learned that Carl Lewis, who at that time was like the best athlete on the planet, somebody who I really worshiped, he was a great track and field athlete for the American Olympic team, and he was vegan, and I just couldn't believe it. Like, you're telling me not only can you be vegan, but that the best athlete in the world is vegan? And my parents are very concerned. They were very nervous that I wasn't going to be healthy, and so they wanted me to go see a nutritionist. And so they brought out the Yellow Pages. And again, for your younger listeners, the Yellow Pages is basically Google, but in physical form. And they figured out the Yellow Pages, and they picked out a nutritionist who was just geographically close to us. And we went to her. And almost by like the grace of God, this nutritionist, coincidentally, in 1993, turned out to be a vegan herself.
Mhm.
And so at that point, I not only became vegan, I essentially decided that I was going to devote the rest of my life to trying to help animals and trying to find ways that we can reduce our reliance on them. And so for the past 3 decades, that's what I've sought to do, including through the most current chapter of my life, which is by running a company making ingredients to try to render the factory farming of animals obsolete.
Mhm. Could you give us a little bit of a genesis about the Better Meat Company?
Sure. So I had devoted at that point like over 20 years of my life to campaigning and lobbying for animals. And I was very proud. I had spent a number of years as a lobbyist and had worked to pass a lot of animal protection laws with a lot of really talented fellow animal advocates. But around like 2015, 2016, I started getting worried. It wasn't that I didn't like what we were doing. It wasn't that I didn't think it was effective. It was just that I thought maybe food technology was going to do even more than what I was doing. And this was the time, it was like the rise of Eat Just and Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. And I started thinking about the ways in which animals have been displaced in the economy before. And so, if you look, for example, for thousands of years, we harpooned whales in order to light our homes with whale oil. And nobody stopped because of crusaders for whales. They stopped because kerosene was invented and it was much cheaper than whale oil, and it decimated the whaling industry. Similarly, for thousands of years, we whipped horses to get around. And nobody stopped because they cared about horses. They stopped because engines were invented and it was a much better way to get around than the horse. For thousands of years, we plucked live geese in order to write letters with quill pens. And nobody stopped plucking geese because they cared about geese. They stopped because metal fountain pens were invented, and all of a sudden you had a much more efficient way to write. You didn't have to dip your quill into an inkwell and sharpen the quill tip. Like, metal fountain pens just dramatically better. As a result, I started thinking, well, maybe food technology is going to do for chickens and pigs what kerosene did for whales, what fountain pens did for geese, and what engines did for horses. And I wasn't sure what I could do, Nick. Like, I just thought I was a dumb lobbyist. I wasn't somebody who was like a food scientist or a microbiologist. I didn't have, an MBA from Harvard. I didn't have millions of dollars to invest as a venture capitalist. So I wasn't sure what I could do. Mm-hmm. And I thought maybe I will write a book, though. And if I write a book, I can incentivize or entice the people who do have the right background to get into this field. And so I got very lucky. It was a pretty hubristic thing to do. I had never published a book before, but I basically pitched a proposal on a book about food technology to help animals. Simon & Schuster bought the book, and it came out in early 2018. It's called Clean Meat: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. And the book did better than I would have ever dreamt, and that opened up a lot of doors for me. And I had a choice. I could either continue writing about the people who I thought were going to solve this problem, or I could just become one of them. And in writing the book, Clean Meat, it became very evident to me that the people running these companies were not indeed these, demigods who were in some different category than I was. In fact, many of them I thought were just as mortal as I was. And I thought if they could be doing it, maybe I'll give my hand a try at it. And so it was at the end of the book tour in the second quarter of 2018, I thought, I'm going to start a company to create ingredients that will do a better job of helping to displace animals in the food industry. And a couple of friends of mine, a food scientist and somebody who actually did have an MBA from Harvard, interestingly enough, decided that we were all going to leave our lives, move to Sacramento, and start this company together. And so that was the genesis of the Better Meat Co. And 6.5 years later, we're still going strong.
Well, 6.5 years is quite a long time in food tech, and it's more of a crowded space today. So how do you differentiate your company from other players in the novel food sector?
Yeah, you're asking a really pertinent question, Nick, because if you look at the ways to mimic meat, there are essentially three of them. It's kind of like an energy, right? Like, people want to get off of fossil fuels. And so how do you do it? Well, you've got solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, maybe green hydrogen. Like, there's all these different ways that people want to use to make energy without fossil fuels. Well, similarly, there's lots of ways to recreate the meat experience without animals. One of them, the most prominent one today, is plant-based meat, right? So you take crops like soybeans or peas or wheat, and you process them into things that look and taste like animal meat. And this is a really promising technology. Obviously, it's in every big box grocery store today. It's on many fast food menus, but it's not sold at price parity, and oftentimes it's distinguishable as a matter of taste. So it oftentimes leaves meat eaters wanting, and on a price basis, it leaves people really wanting. And so even though plant-based meat has proliferated to the point where you can get it in every Walmart and Costco in America now, the taste is still a concern for some people. And really, I think more importantly, the price is really it's not near price parity most of the time. Usually it's sold at sometimes like multiples over the price of commodity meat. So if you don't want to go to the plant kingdom, you can go to the animal kingdom and use animal cells and make actual cultivated meat, like real meat from animal cells. And this is also a really promising technology. But if you don't like the price of plant-based meat, you're really not going to like the price of cultivated meat, which is today at least dramatically higher than plant-based meat, which is why, despite having regulatory approval, the companies that are approved to sell are largely not selling. They just can't produce enough of it at cheap enough quantities. And to be honest with you, Nick, while I am bullish on that sector, I really am. I think it's going to be a big deal in the future. It's in the future. I don't believe that you're going to have cultivated meat reaching even where plant-based meat is today in the 2020s. And what I mean by that is, plant-based meat is now in, again, every chain grocery store for the most part in America. But I don't think you're going to have cultivated meat reaching that in the 2020s, maybe in the 2030s. And so I'm still bullish on it. I just think it's futuristic still. I mean, it's not science fiction. It is science fact. You can do it. But whether you're going to be able to scale up and get it down to a few dollars a pound, that's really hard to do as far as the current technology is concerned, at least. Hopefully there'll be some miraculous new invention. So that is a long-winded way of saying if you don't want to use plants and you don't want to use animal cells, there is one more kingdom that you can check out. And that, of course, is the F word, or fungi. And fungi are a completely different kingdom. Fungi are an amazing kingdom of very different species from plants or animals. Fungi are way closer to animals, evolutionarily speaking, than they are to plants. This is, for example, you can think about how mushrooms have actually been used as a meat substitute in Asian cuisine for centuries. And it's not a surprise that there are many mushrooms that have a far more meat-like texture than plants do, because fungi and animals are actually much closer to each other evolutionarily, as I mentioned. But what we do at the Better Meat Co. is not growing mushrooms. We grow microbial fungi, or sometimes known as mycelium or mycoprotein. And mycelium is the root-like filaments that blanket the earth. Every time you're walking over it, you're stepping on mycelium. But what we do is we grow that inside of a stainless steel vessel. We take a process that occurs in nature, we wrap stainless steel around it, and we allow it to occur faster than it otherwise normally would. It's all natural. And the process that comes out of that fermentation system is a whole food, all natural ingredient that we call rhiza mycoprotein, that in its all natural whole food state has more protein than eggs. It's a complete protein, meaning it has all the essential amino acids. It's got more iron than beef, more zinc than beef, and it gets more potassium than bananas and more fiber than oats. In other words, you get all the things about meat that you want: craveable meat-like texture, protein, iron, zinc. But you don't get the things about meat that you don't want: saturated fat, cholesterol, animal cruelty, environmental degradation, and more. And so this ingredient, I think, answers 2 or 3 of the biggest deficiencies of plant-based meat today. One is on taste. This is a more meat-like texture than plant-based meats typically are. 2 is on price, because this is a whole food. We can produce it pretty inexpensively. And then 3 is the perception. The problem of the perception of plant-based meat, unfortunately, is that some people think that it's this too processed food, right? And I'm not sympathetic to that argument. I like plant-based meat. I eat plant-based meat. I think it's great to eat. However, you can't deny there is a perception among some people, at least, that it's an ultra-processed food. And in our case, the mycelium that we grow is a whole food that's all natural. It's not been fractionated, isolated, extruded, simply straight from the fermenter to your fork. And so I think that the mycoprotein that we grow at the Better Meat Co. really is the antidote to the woes that have been plaguing plant-based meat in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. What have been some of your big challenges and limitations to producing your product on a massive commercial scale?
Yeah, it's an important question, Nick, because we are in a position where we can produce it. And we're not just producing it in a lab. We have built a 3-story tall bioreactor from which we churn out a river of our mycoprotein. However, we can only produce thousands of kilos. We can't produce millions of kilos. In other words, we can sell to some small companies, we can sell to some individual restaurants, and we do that. We're on restaurant menus, we're selling to other small companies, and we're proud of that work. However, if we want to actually get to start selling millions or tens of millions of pounds, we need to build a much larger factory. What I believe is going to help end the factory farming of animals is large-scale mycoprotein production systems, which can compete on cost with animal-based meat. Now, that is the dream. How do we get there? Frankly, we need to raise money. We have to raise enough money to build a commercial manufacturing facility. The cost needed to do this is nowhere near the cost of building cultivated meat facilities, which are in the hundreds of millions. but it is tens of millions of dollars to build this. And so we're recording in September of 2024. Starting in October, we're going to go out and seek to raise a financing round that can help to build the facility that we're seeking to build.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the cost competitiveness of Reza, how does that compare to traditional meat products at the moment? You say you've got a few customers already.
Yeah, so we typically sell it for around the price of beef today.
Hmm.
And our goal eventually is to get down to around the price of chicken, which is substantially cheaper than beef. That's the goal. We'll see if we can do it. There's really only one company that's built a successful business around mycoprotein production, which is Quorn, Quorn, in the UK. And last year I was over in the UK and I went to KFC to see because I heard that they were selling corn there. And really interestingly, the corn mycoprotein, which is different from ours in the Better Mico, but still, it's a fungi fermentation process, was on menu at KFC for nearly price parity. Not identical, but it was very close. And so, I thought that is an amazing feat. Today, a product grown inside of a massive fermenter is competing virtually on cost with the cheapest chicken, fast food chicken. That is a great testament to this type of technology. And we want to go even lower than what they're doing.
Hmm. And what did that taste like for you?
I wish I had ordered it. The problem, I'm so embarrassed, Nick. I'm so embarrassed. I had just eaten lunch right before then, and then I passed KFC. I was like, "Oh, I want to go look at the menu because I heard corn is there." So I didn't actually get it, but I've eaten corn many times, and I like the product.
Hmm. I'm just curious about if you're able to go into a bit more detail about your production process. I mean, what are the main steps involved? The
Sure.
fermentation process and the conditions and inputs involved.
Yeah, sure, of course. So imagine, Nick, like it takes a cow a year of feeding in order to get a steak. It takes a pig about 5 or 6 months of feeding before you get a pork chop. It takes chickens about 40 days of feeding before you get a nugget. In our case, from the time that we inoculate our fermenter to the time that we harvest our fermenter is less than one single day. We can go from inoculation to harvest in about 17 hours. And what that entails is essentially filling up a fermenter with water and sugar and putting your spores in there and letting them feast on that sugar and enjoy it. And they grow up and then we eat them. It's not that dissimilar to chicken farming, except instead of using animals, we're using microbes. And instead of just eating a part of the organism being grown, like the meat on a chicken, we're eating the entire thing, right? So we're eating 100% of that solid biomass that grows inside of the fermenter. And so once it comes out of the fermenter, the process is pretty simple. We simply wring water out of it and chop it up and dry it. That's it. So we squeeze water out of it, we chop it up, we dry it, and then we ship it to customers who rehydrate it and put it into product application. It's a very natural process with an organism that's been safely consumed by humanity for centuries. And to be blunt, it's delicious. If you like meat, you'll love rhizomycoprotein.
Hmm. We're going to talk about some of the differences between those three subsects of all proteins: plant-based, fungi, and animal cell cultured. Now, what are the key factors that determine taste and texture of those three subsects, and how do these factors differ between the three types?
So I'm an advocate for all three, for plant-based, animal cell cultured, and fungi fermentation. I think all three are great, just like I'm a fan for solar, wind, and geothermal, right? But they are different, and they produce different things, and they each have different pros and cons. Um, and plant-based has the advantage of having been scaled massively already today, and animal cell culture is still really too expensive to make large amounts of cells right now. And fungi fermentation is scaled by corn, but for the most part, there's only one company that's made it, like I said, a successful business out of this.
Hmm.
The others, we're growing different strains, we're growing different things, and so it's like if you think about take like let's say animals, right? Like corn is 99% of mycoprotein right now in the market. So imagine a scenario where you only had one animal grown for food. Let's say, you only had cows, right? Nobody was eating chickens or pigs. Or imagine you only had one plant like soybeans, right? Nobody's eating peas or wheat or anything. That's what it's like right now. But there are thousands of other species out there that you can grow. And the same is so with fungi. Even though corn's species is the one that's primarily used, there are thousands of other species that you can grow. And we at the Better Meat Co. are focused on one in particular, which gets a really great meat-like texture and grows really rapidly.
Yeah, yeah. So how do plant-based, fungi-based, and cell culture meats differ in their content of essential vitamins, minerals, and fatty acids? Are there any specific pros and cons of each?
Yes, absolutely. So take, for example, let's say pea protein, which is the hero ingredient in a Beyond Burger and so on. Pea protein is basically protein, right? So you've taken the pea, you have harvested a field of peas, you've milled it into a flour, but the flour is very low protein. So you strip out the fiber, you strip out the fat, you concentrate it down into a pea protein isolate that like an athlete might take as a supplement, right? And then you texturize it by extruding it. And that's basically a lot of pressure and a lot of heat. That changes the molecular structure of your pea protein isolate into something that has more of a meat-like texture. Now, that product is a great product to make a meat-like texture, but you've stripped away a lot of the nutrients, especially the fiber that was in there. On the other hand, fungi fermented products, like what we grow at the Better Meat Co. with rhizomycoprotein, has not been stripped out, but it's lower in protein. It's about 50% protein on a dry weight basis as opposed to like 70 or 80% compared to pea protein isolate. So you're getting less protein than an isolate, but you're getting way more fiber. And so in that case, you're getting a lot of protein and a lot of fiber, whereas in the case of pea protein, you're getting even more protein but no fiber or less fiber. And so that's one difference between the two most common things that we're talking about here. But in the case of our rhizomycoprotein, you really get something that is a nutritional powerhouse. So you get something that not only is packed with protein, iron, and zinc and fiber, but it's also very rich in beta glucans, which has been shown to be beneficial for your gut microbiome. And so you end up getting really like a superfood, something that is low in calories, high in protein, high in fiber, and really rich in beta glucans. It's almost like a superfood, really.
Mhm. There's a school of thought among some consumers that plant-based ultra processed, and obviously there's some skepticism about cell cultured foods at the moment. What were your thoughts on how consumers generally perceive these different types of technologies? Are there any sort of cultural or psychological factors that influence their preferences?
Yeah, I certainly think so. And I am very happy to eat plant-based meat. I don't think that, like to compare, let's say a Beyond Burger to, a truly ultra processed food, let's say like Doritos or something. I mean, it's just not a fair comparison. And more important, it should be compared to the food that it is displacing, right? So a Beyond Burger compared to a conventional beef burger has zero cholesterol, it has way less saturated fat and fewer calories. Like
Mhm.
it's better for you. Like nobody's going to say it's as good as eating a kale salad, but it is better for you than eating a conventional burger. That's just a fact. Now,
Mhm.
is it a health food? I don't know. That's in the eye of the beholder, but it is healthier than the food that it is displacing. And so
Mhm.
I don't concede to this point on the ultra processed foods part. However, that said, we have to deal with the reality. And the reality is that there are some people who actually are concerned about this critique. And the answer is not just to tell them you're wrong. The answer is to provide something that they feel good about, rightly or wrongly. And if you want an all natural, whole food, single ingredient that does an even better job of mimicking the meat experience, mycoprotein is the answer for that concern.
Mhm. And what about things like amino acid profiles? How do they stack up against
Yeah.
traditional animal or plant proteins?
Sure. So plant proteins have different acid scores. Soy is the best. So there are some strains of soy that have a PDCAS score between zero point 0.9 to 1. So
Mhm.
just to be clear, PDCAS is basically a measurement of protein digestibility, like how quote unquote complete the protein is, and meaning it has all the essential amino acids. And soy is the best. But more commonly, people look at P, which is closer to like let's say a zero point 0.7. PDCAS goes from 0 to 1, 1 being the optimal,
Mhm.
and beef is like a zero point 0.9, and egg whites are like a 1, But rhizomycoprotein, the last time we measured it, it was like 0.96. So better than beef and pretty much the same as just like the optimal protein, honestly.
Hmm. Now, of vital importance, considering the sector, is the environmental benefits of microproteins. So how do they compare to traditional animal proteins in terms of land use, water consumption, GHGs?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's actually a peer-reviewed published study in 2024 on this very topic, looking at mycoprotein versus both animal and plant proteins. And mycoprotein was the lowest footprint of all. Not, I mean,
Right.
obviously way lower than animal protein, which are, the heaviest footprint, especially beef, but even better than many plant protein isolates. So, look, it was very similar. Plant protein and mycoprotein were very similar on the greenhouse gas chart, but for the most part, you're looking at something that has a dramatically smaller footprint on the planet and then raising animals for food and is much better for us too. And it's a win-win all around.
Mhm. In terms of the functionality of the product that you can produce, I mean, how do they perform in terms of things like water holding capacity and emulsification and
Wow.
gelation, etc.?
Nick, you're speaking my language. I presume most people don't even know what some of these things mean. But interestingly enough, we've done numerous both oil and water holding capacity tests with our mycoprotein compared to conventional plant proteins, and it's phenomenal. It does a much better job. So you get a better yield on the product. And for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, basically think about how much water or how much oil a certain ingredient can hold, right? That you put it in water, how much can it absorb? And the better it does, the better yield you get. So from a food manufacturer's perspective, this basically improves yield and it improves the mouthfeel because it'll be like a juicier bite when you bite into it. And so the rhizomycoprotein water and oil holding capacity is superior to plant protein isolates.
Hmm. And in terms of the cost of producing the product, how does that compare to other sources such as soy or even meat?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to beat soy on price. Look, soy has had many decades of very intensive breeding programs to increase protein and increase yield. Whereas we in the microbial fungi world are using essentially non-domesticated wild strains. So while I do believe that we will eventually get much better, we are still, not going to be as cheap as soy protein. But it's comparable to pea protein, for sure, like to comparable to like a texturized pea protein cost.
Hmm. Are there any environmental concerns at all related to the cultivation or processing of microproteins?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Look, I don't want to sugarcoat it, Nick. Like the reality is that growing food has an environmental impact, right? The question
Hmm.
is how do you reduce that impact? And growing mycoprotein takes up way less land and way fewer greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, compared to animals. But it doesn't mean it has no impact, right? The only thing that's no impact is fasting. Right? If you don't eat, then you'll have no impact. But otherwise, if you're eating, you're probably causing environmental impact. And there are impacts associated with it. Most notably is that you're basically feeding this thing sugar, right? So you got to grow sugar to feed in your microbes. Now, are there ways around that? Lots of companies fantasize about valorizing side streams from agricultural waste processes they could use as a feedstock. Nobody has successfully industrialized such a process yet, and it would be great to do it. It's very difficult to do, though. We've certainly tried many times. So for now, we're stuck with sugar, but in the future, maybe there will be some other method of feeding the microbes. But even growing sugar for this, it's still way, way, way less land intensive than, let's say, growing corn for cows, right?
Hmm. Definitely, definitely. Now, I like what you said at the start about the technologies from the past that have ended millennia long uses of animals, tractors and internal combustion engines and even lab animals, I guess, to some extent. I mean, how do you think societal attitudes towards animal consumption might evolve over time, especially when we become more aware of the environmental and ethical implications? Um,
Yeah, yeah, Nick, you're hitting the nail on the head. Think about the examples that you just used, right? So go back, let's say, to whales. We used to view whales as a source of light. We killed them so that we could put whale oil in lamps and light our homes. Today, we still have a lot of boats that go out looking for whales, except now we shoot them with cameras rather than with harpoons. And imagine if you had told somebody in 1850 that, 150 years later, there'd be a major industry where people paid merely to go look at whales, right? They would
mhm,
find that absolutely incredible. They could not imagine it. And we view whales today as these majestic creatures. It's illegal to kill them. It's like a truly, like, we view them as their own category. And the reality is that didn't happen because people had some change of heart that led to us stopping whaling. What happened is that we stopped whaling and then we had a change of heart, right? We were no longer reliant on the exploitation of whales. And so it became much easier for us to accept that whales were these highly intelligent animals who shouldn't be subjected to the type of violence and cruelty to which we were subjecting them for thousands of years. And now we think of whales very differently. Similarly, we used to view horses as beasts of burden. Now they're largely viewed as companion animals for the most part, because we're no longer so reliant on them. That's another example. And so it brings to mind the old adage that it is easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. Usually you change your behavior and then you change your mind. We like to think that we are these rational creatures who change our mind and then our behavior change flows from that. But most of the time, we don't like cognitive dissonance. Most of the time, we're not. There's a great line that I did not invent. I don't remember who did, but I think it was Ben Franklin actually. But where, most people, when asked to either change their mind or prove that they were right, they immediately set forward on the proof that they were right. Most people are going to do that. And so once you, though, no longer are so dependent on the exploitation of animals, it becomes much easier to recognize that animals are intelligent creatures who deserve to have some protection from cruelty. There's an interesting study that was done on this where they gave people, two different groups of people, the same exact test. And it was asking them about their views about the intelligence of cows. And one group was given peanuts to snack on while taking the test. The other group was given beef jerky. And despite the fact that these two groups had no discernible differences between them, the group that was given the beef jerky rated the intelligence of cows far lower than the group that was given peanuts, because literally they're taking a test about the intelligence of cows while they're eating cows. And so you don't want to admit that these cows were intelligent beings. Rather, you want to reduce your cognitive dissonance. So you say, no, these cows are actually dim-witted. And that happens every day in our actual lives, where we think of animals as commodities who exist to be exploited by humanity. But I think that once we're less reliant on animals, that view will be easier to change. And the same thing happened with slavery in the United States. After all, the entire north part of the United States legislated against slavery, whereas the southern part of the United States was willing to go to war to preserve slavery. Why? Why was the North willing to legislate? Because they had largely industrialized their economy, and so slavery, which is far more suited for an agrarian economy, was less vital to the economic interests of the Northerners compared to the Southerners. And so the Northerners, no longer so economically reliant on human chattel, were willing to legislate and find it immoral, whereas the Southerners, still totally economically dependent as they viewed it on slavery, created an entire race-based system where they justified slavery on biblical terms, ethical terms, philosophical terms, and so on, because they just couldn't stand the thought of having cognitive dissonance, so they were doing something as abominable as holding other human beings in bondage. Now, today, we look back on slavery as the moral sin that it is. It's a stain on the history of humanity, not just America, but the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians. They all had slaves. There's slavery all throughout the Bible, God purposely enslaving people in the Bible. Slavery was so common in human history. But today, we view slavery as a moral abomination, thankfully. But I think that the reason why we've come to be able to view it that way is because we are no longer primarily an agrarian society. And in agrarian societies that are still in existence today, you do find slavery, even illegal slavery, happening far more frequently than you would find in industrialized societies. And so anyway, this is another way of just saying, we need to reduce our reliance on animals, I think, to make it easier for us to recognize animals as the beings worthy of protection who they are.
Mm-hmm. So presumably you're hoping for a future where animal products are seen, consuming animal products are seen as morally questionable in the same way.
I do think that future generations are going to look back in utter horror at what we did to chickens and pigs and cows. I think that if you Think about all the ways that our future descendants may condemn us. That seems to be one of the top things that I can think of, at least, that will be viewed as very questionable about our behavior. They'll ask, how could we have ever tolerated the widespread systemic cruelty that's inflicted upon these animals, where animal cruelty is not the exception, but rather is the norm in how we raise animals for food? Just to give two examples, in the egg industry, the typical way that these birds are treated is they're kept in cages so small they can't even spread their wings. This isn't one bad apple or one bad egg, pun intended. This is the typical way the egg industry globally raises birds, is in cages where each bird has less space than a single sheet of paper on which to live for more than a year before she is slaughtered. It's hard to imagine something more abusive. Similarly, in the pork industry, it's still customary practice to take mother pigs and put them inside of cages 2 feet wide. Like parked cars, they just stand there, facing forward. They can lay down and stand up, but they can't even turn around for months and months on end. They develop pressure sores from laying on the hard concrete in their cages where they are immobilized. And, we don't treat the worst criminals in our society the way that we treat these animals. We don't take murderers and rapists and put them in jail cells so small that they can't even lift their arms, or they can't even turn around. Yet that is common practice for chickens and pigs by the millions. Yet that is the norm for how we treat chickens and pigs in factory farms. The majority of chickens and breeding pigs on factory farms, which produce nearly all the meat and eggs that we consume, are kept in a state of virtual immobilization. And I do think that in the future, that yes, people will look back and they'll think, how could anyone have tolerated such abuse of millions of innocent animals?
Animal welfare is obviously one of the driving factors that's influencing consumers today, but there's also the environment. How do you believe the growing concern about climate change and environmental degradation will impact our food choices?
I hope more than it will. I hope more than it does today, I should say. I just think when people buy food, most of the time, the reason they buy food has to do with the fact that they like the taste and they like the price. That's it. Most people are not thinking about animal welfare or the environment when they buy food. There's a small number of people who do. You and I perhaps are two of them, but most people do not. And I don't think it's that shocking, like when I buy clothing, I'm usually not sitting around thinking, oh, like, how was this produced? The shirt was made in Bangladesh. What might have been the conditions where it was produced? Like, I don't really think about it that much. I should. It'd be better if I did. And I perceive myself as an ethical person, and yet still, I'm sure I make suboptimal decisions all the time. So the question is, like, when people buy food, are they thinking about how many greenhouse gas emissions are associated with that food, how much animal welfare problem is associated with it? And I just think most people don't think about that. Most people just are thinking, I like the taste, I like the price. And that's why I believe that if we can create foods that taste just as good, if not better, and that actually beat animal products on price, that many people, maybe not all, but many people will be quite happy to shift. And I think about it like light. When you walk into a room, Nick, you don't sit there thinking, where did this light come from? Was it from coal or oil? Did it come from wind or solar? Like, we don't think about it. We just say, I have an illuminated room. That's good enough for me, right? And the same is true with meat. When most people eat meat, they're not sitting around thinking, I'm so glad an animal was slaughtered for this, right? They don't think about it at all. It's not like they're glad an animal was slaughtered. They don't like the animal. If anything, they might prefer that an animal not be slaughtered for it. But if there was something that were cheaper and that tasted as good, if not better, yes, I actually think that many people would be quite happy to switch. And then those are the type of people who are going to say, I can't believe how they treat animals, because they already are now absolving themselves of association with that problem.
Let's assume we're a bit further down the road. In what ways will a post-animal bioeconomy change the planet for you, Paul?
Well, one, the planet will look greener from space. So if you're on the International Space Station, or if you're in a SpaceX capsule up there and you look down, there will be far more trees than there would have been otherwise. Similarly, the oceans will be filled with far more animals and far more life than they are today, which we've just decimated ocean life with our desire to eat fish. And we will have far less pandemic risk. We will have far less heart disease, which is the number one killer of all Americans and all British. And we will have a world in which I think that people might recognize that maybe what we did to animals wasn't that great.
Hmm.
I think about it like, let's say, Galileo and Copernicus helped us to understand that we human beings are not the center of the physical universe, right? Well, maybe in the future, our descendants will recognize that perhaps we're not the center of the moral universe either. That maybe the animals of this planet exist not merely for us, but they exist with us. And that rather than being treated as mere commodities who exist for the sole purpose of serving humanity with whatever needs or pleasures we want, that they exist for their own reasons.
Hmm.
That they're not just here to be exploited by us. And I think that would be a better world. There surely would still be problems in the world. There surely would be a lot of work to do to continue to perfect humanity and to perfect the world. But boy, would it be a lot better if we weren't
Hmm.
causing such abject misery to billions of individuals who have done nothing to deserve it.
Playing devil's advocate, I mean, you were a lobbyist, and obviously there are people lobbying against the types of products that this industry is producing. Are there any potential economic implications of a transition to a post-animal bioeconomy? I mean, how will this affect jobs, industries, and rural communities?
Yeah, there's no way to downplay this. It would impact the economy in both good and bad ways. So I'll give you an example. When we went away from watching videos from Blockbuster Video, eventually went to DVDs, and then that we ordered by mail, to now streaming. And we're thrilled, right? Nobody is thinking as they're streaming Game of Thrones, oh, I feel so bad for everybody at Blockbuster who lost their job. But they
Hmm.
did. And we should feel bad for them. Like there are lots of people who worked at Blockbuster who no longer have jobs. And the same is true even with tobacco. Tobacco consumption has plummeted in the United States, plummeted. And there's way fewer people involved in growing and producing tobacco, and those people lost their jobs. And we're not sitting around thinking, oh, I feel so bad for those people who lost their jobs in the tobacco industry, but maybe we should. Now, I'm not saying that we should go back to the days of VHS video or back to the days where more people smoked. Obviously, I don't believe that. But I do think that we should be cognizant of the fact that there is a creative destruction process that occurs whenever innovation displaces an incumbent industry. And that is going to happen when it comes to animal agriculture and these new methods of producing protein. And so the key is to help people find ways in the new economy to actually still make a living. And
Hmm.
so I'll give you one example. The tobacco growers, many of them switched to growing chickpeas. And there's been a huge increase in demand for hummus in the United States. And so we need to grow a lot more acres of chickpeas now than we did before. So a lot of tobacco growers have shifted to chickpeas. Similarly, there's a lot of people who work at Netflix, right? And those jobs didn't exist before. And I think that it's really incumbent upon us to have training programs that allow for people who are involved in agriculture to produce the types of crops that are necessary for these types of fermentation and cell culture processes, right? These aren't divorced from agriculture. They're more efficient, true, but they're not divorced from agriculture. And these processes still rely on agricultural inputs. And it would be great to work with the farmers who are right now, let's say, growing corn and soy for livestock feed to instead grow what we need to make protein without animals.
Hmm. And finally, Paul, we're going to talk about how a post-animal bioeconomy could change the human-non-human relationship. So, are there any ethical implications of creating synthetic or plant-based or mycoprotein-based alternatives? Are there any risks or unintended consequences or new forms of exploitation?
Well, those are really different questions. So let me go and start with the risk. One risk that some people would be concerned about is that there will be a whole lot fewer cows, pigs, and chickens, right? And so, why would we keep cows, pigs, and chickens around if we're not using them for food? Now, of course, some people still have horses, even though we don't really rely on horses for transportation anymore. But there's a lot fewer horses, right, than if we were all relying on them to transport us and our things around. And I think there would still be some cows and pigs and chickens because some people might want them for a quaint experience or to have them as pets or so on. But there'd be a lot fewer of them. And there'd be some people who would be concerned about what they would perceive as a quote unquote extinction. Now, frankly, I don't really think that's accurate, that it should be referred to as an extinction for an animal who was only invented in, modern times, like evolutionarily speaking, right? These aren't
Hmm.
animals who existed in nature. They're animals who were domesticated by humanity and brought to places where they would, produce a lot of milk, eggs, or meat. Now, that said, I do think that you would have a lot more nature. There'd be a lot more wildlife out there because we would need to farm less land. And so you could convert a lot of that land back into like a rewilded nature. That would be a really big positive to rewild much of the earth. And then you asked about also potential new forms of exploitation. And I think there's always a risk of that. Wherever there's money to be made and animals involved, animals will likely be exploited. It's just the
Hmm.
reality, unfortunately. And so I think we need to be wary of that. Now, I don't think it's like a risk like we're going to start, locking up animals for fungi fermentation. No, I don't think that's it. But you never know what's going to happen. Like there might be
Hmm.
new things, like especially as we, for example, move more into a world which is really guided by artificial intelligence. Will AI displace the use of animals in research or enhance it? You alluded to this earlier. Like, it's possible that we could use AI to more efficiently search for new drug compounds that can be beneficial for humanity. But it's also possible we could use it just to figure out more efficient ways of exploiting animals to create new animal tests.
Hmm.
So like I do worry about that. Like technology is a two-edged knife, right? It can be used for good or bad.
Hmm.
And even let's say like the cotton gin, you go back to the slavery example, the invention of the cotton gin, which was supposed to make it much easier to separate the seeds from the cotton, ultimately ended up really entrenching slavery because it made slavery that much more profitable. And so that was a technological invention that some historians have argued we might not have even had a civil war had it not been for Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, because cotton wouldn't have been so important to the South. It was important, but maybe not as important as it ultimately became by the 1860s. And so, new technologies, you never know how they're going to play out and what they're going to do. There's going to be certainly, unintended consequences, I don't doubt. But it's hard to see anything that liberates humanity from its reliance on animal slaughter as having a net negative, right? I can see maybe there are some negatives, but a net negative, hard for me to fathom.
Hmm. And what about the concerns of individuals who have strong cultural or religious ties to animal-based products?
Well, I mean, even in the United States today, we have exemptions in our animal welfare laws for religious slaughter, as an example.
Hmm.
If you want to kill animals in a kosher or a halal slaughter plant, there's basically no legal requirement for anything for you. You're exempted from the law. So if killing animals is part of your religion, I would imagine most countries will probably still allow it, at least for a long time.
Hmm. Look, Paul, I think that's all we've got time for. I'll just have one final question. It's coming back to the Better Meat Company. You've had a lot of important announcements recently. One, I think, involved your self-affirming grass, was it?
It's not self-affirmed; it's FDA
Okay.
affirmed grass. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. And how important was that for you as a company?
Thanks. It's very generous of you, Nick. So, GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe, and it's a determination that basically says your ingredient is, as it seems, generally recognized as safe. And so, what most companies will do is if they have some type of a novel ingredient, they'll self affirm their GRAS. So, they'll run a bunch of studies and say, we are satisfied that our ingredient is generally recognized as safe. What we at the Better Meat Co. did was we did that, and then we submitted a 200-page dossier of all of our safety data to the FDA and USDA, and we said, we think it's safe. You tell us what you think. And the
Mhm.
FDA and USDA came back and said, we have no questions about this, meaning that our ingredient is FDA grass, not just self affirmed grass. And so big food companies that otherwise wouldn't buy self affirmed grass ingredients can buy our product.
Mhm. And there was also an announcement about the Department of Defense, I think.
Yeah, so we are now the first alternative protein company to receive a grant from the U.S. Department of Defense. And the goal of this grant is to bolster biomanufacturing in America. We already now are spending as a nation a lot to try to onshore manufacturing of things like semiconductors and solar panels. And we want to make sure that we don't outsource the future of food, which is going to be biomanufactured. And as a result, we're very proud to be working with the Department of Defense and hope to do even more.
Mhm. Now, I'm not going to ask you to nail your colours to any particular political mast, but are you concerned about um, a change? What should we say? A change in tact when it comes to funding the bioeconomy, if a new government comes into power?
Well, there will be a new government in power either way. So Kamala Harris or Donald Trump will win.
Hmm.
And so we will have a new president, one way or the other, next year. And yeah, I'm always concerned about what a change in policy will do. Harris is obviously more likely to continue Biden policies, and this biomanufacturing program that we are part of is a Biden executive order. So I do think that she would be less likely to end that program. But Donald Trump doesn't want to offshore jobs either, right? So we want to like American presidents want jobs in America, and
Hmm.
so I think that this is one program that is less likely to be cut if Trump were to win. But I don't know. Maybe he'll want to cut it out of spite because because it was a Biden program. Of course, I have no way of predicting any of this stuff. But I do think that um, there are pros and cons for the issues that we care about with regard to alternative protein to both parties. And I'll just give you one example. When Trump was president, his Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, was very bullish on cultivated meat and talked about how we needed to compete to make sure that cultivated meat production isn't dominated by China.
Hmm.
That's one way to look at it from the Republican Party's perspective. Whereas a Democrat might say, yeah, we don't want them to dominate, but we also think it's important for climate change, et cetera. So I think there's different ways of making the argument that get to the same outcome. But we'll see. These are all like my speculations as a layperson, not as a political pundit, which I can assure you my powers of punditry are quite limited.
Not from what I've heard. I'm an avid listener of your podcast, and yeah,
Well, I'm honored. Thank you.
it's an absolute pleasure to have spent the last 50 or so minutes talking with you, Paul. Thank you very much. I can only wish you all the luck in the future, and we'll be monitoring things very, very closely here at PPTI.
Well, thanks so much for all that you're doing to advance future foods and animal welfare on the planet, Nick. I'm grateful.
Thank you, mate. Take care.